Hello, good evening and welcome. Welcome to the 10th and, at least for the moment, final event in the series Towards Another Architecture. Organised by the Farrell Centre, which is a new public centre for architecture and cities in Newcastle, in collaboration with the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape at Newcastle University. I'm Adam Shah, I'm Professor of Architecture here, and I'm filling in for Owen Hopkins, who's Director of the Farrell Centre. Owen's introduction to the series goes as follows. The starting point is the realisation that it's now 100 years since the first essays that would later form Le Corbusier's Vers une architecture and that were published in the magazine L'Esprit Nouveau. Today, we live at another pivotal moment for architecture and for the wider world. The series emerges from the contention that what we need to make sense of this moment is not a new architecture, as Le Corbusier was popularly mistranslated as advocating, but another one, an architecture that's not bound to a single vision or future, but is diverse, plural, and sustains multiple conversations about the active role that architects might play in the world. This series of events therefore invites a number of practitioners and thinkers working in a range of fields and geographies to reflect on this pivotal moment and to advocate their visions for another architecture. The format is something like 30 minutes of presentation followed by another 30 minutes of questions and answers, so please have your questions ready. We ask attendees to submit their questions first via the chat, and then we try to go live to them to ask the questions, so I'll remind you of that when we get there. Last week, we heard from Afina de Jong, who leads Afari, an Amsterdam-based architectural agency that crosses boundaries of the traditional architectural practice by dealing with the existing city, taking an intersectional and interdisciplinary approach, integrating theory and research with design. This evening, we're delighted to welcome Adam Nathaniel Furman and Joshua Mardell. Adam is a British artist and designer of Argentine and Japanese heritage based in London, who works in spatial design and art of all scales, from video and prints to large public artworks, architecturally integrated ornament, as well as products, furniture, interiors, publishing and academic work. Joshua Mardell is an architectural historian who's primarily interested in themes of historiographical retrieval. He read for his PhD at the Institute for the History and Theory of Architecture at ETH Zurich, and is currently an associate lecturer at the Department for the History of Art at the University of York and a co-editor of the Journal of Architecture. They're going to be talking about their co-edited book, Queer Spaces, an Atlas of LGBTQIA+ spaces, places and stories, which will be published by RIBA Publishing early next month. And I think Joshua is speaking first and then Adam. Is that right?
Yep.
Great. In which case, over to you.
Great. So shall we share the slides then, please? Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you very much for the opportunity as well. And excuse the rather boring background here. I'm in a hotel at the moment, which also comes with hotel shampoo, so forgive the hair too. So in queer history writing, there is a kind of tradition of drawing on the personal. So with that in mind, I thought I'd actually open unusually with some sort of queer autobiography, which I'll then link, if rather tangentially, to my research interests, so you get a sense of where the Queer Spaces book fits within my broader trajectory. And then I'll introduce a couple of my favorite spaces in the book, and I think Adam will do much the same thing after me. So I grew up in Letchworth Garden City in Hertfordshire, albeit I was an outsider in that I grew up on the council estate, which interestingly wasn't really seen as part of the Garden City utopian paradigm, although it certainly was. My queerness, I suppose, made itself manifest with puberty, although I didn't come out till maybe sixth form, in some cases later, but I became increasingly estranged from friends at school. I wasn't invited to the parties with the girls. I wouldn't have known how to socialize if I was. And I've thought about this, and I wonder if this sort of aloofness enabled me to follow my architectural path, wandering around, looking at buildings, intuitively perhaps identifying Letchworth's urbanistic and architectural qualities at a young age, feeling a great sense of injustice when arts and crafts windows were replaced with UPVC, etc. I also remember suppressing bits of my inner camp, if you like, in order to conform, to survive the trip down to the newsagents, to survive the bus journey to school. I went to a sixth form college in Cambridge, firmly middle class, I suppose, for what that's worth. Gays existed quite visibly. And there was a A-level in photography, and the darkroom somehow became the first queer space, perhaps, that I identified, where I had my first gay kiss and other things. And darkness lends itself to queer experience, I think. Another queer space, oddly enough, was the conference venues of Young Labour, most memorably in Grantham, ironically, as the hometown of Margaret Thatcher. I tagged along with the University of Cambridge Labour Society. I don't know if that was allowed, and the parties were really gay. It was a safe space to discuss social justice, but also to be freely oneself. I studied architectural history for my master's at Cambridge, which is a super safe place to be queer. There is also that somewhat underexplored pedigree there, the still reasonably contemporaneous campy world of David Watkin and the residues of the so-called Peterhouse right, which I had nothing to do with. So that's also by the way. And I went on to pursue a PhD at ETH, as Adam said, and there was an absence there of queer presence, at least in the School of Architecture. In fact, Adam gave a lecture there yesterday. So an outsider myself, I worked on a topic of outsider architects, antiquarian architects of the 19th century. And this topic was oddly, wholly and absolutely accepted at the ETH, even if it was miles away from what anyone else was doing. It was anti-canonical. It was about non-salient figures who were at least seemingly quite non-innovatory, quite in the face of the enduring historiographical foci. So my approach as a historian is informed by queerness as a sensibility. And I think the best way of summing up my intellectual project, should we have the next slide, is that of a project of retrieval. So it's rather similar to, if you like, the Betjumanic theme of neglect for those interested in that kind of elegiac romanticism for architecture through figures like Sir John Betjeman, who stood up for the underdogs, the rogues, the off-beam. It's about retrieval of the marginalized and the forgotten in the history of architecture. So my project, as I see it, is about validating the missing sections of architectural history. It's primarily a historiographical project, so the way history is being written, but the politics of how it's being written, the consequences of that. And this isn't divorced from architectural practice. The historical study of architecture, of course, has participated in the way that architects do architecture, how they see it, what's in the canon, what's on the survey courses, what goes on the shelves of the library, what's physically out there to notice in the first place. So I thought before mentioning the book, I'll quickly contextualize it by mentioning a couple of other things that I've worked on. So this retrieval can be seen, for instance, in my work on peripheral or somewhat colorful unsung figures, including my work on various post-war architects trained at the Architecture Association, who were involved in one way or another with CIAM, the International Congress of Modern Architects, established in 1928 by Le Corbusier and others, and disbanded in 1959. So I've looked at, for instance, a couple of self-declared anarchists, or barefoot architects who came out of the AA at the end of World War II and devoted themselves to assisting with self-built housing in Peru and Colombia, namely John Turner and Pat Crook. Both of them were editors of Plan magazine, the magazine of the Architectural Students Association, basically hijacked by the AA. And this is Crook's modular monkey on the slide, which was really meant as nothing more than an amusing contribution on the editorial pin-up board used to post ideas for the magazine, but it sort of speaks for that anarchism of turning architecture on its head, almost literally. So it's essentially queering Corb, we might say. And I think it chimes with the way that this talk series has been put together, another kind of architecture, diverse and plural. Next slide. I've also looked at the architect John Volker. He was a peripheral member of the CIAM avant-garde, a founding member of Team 10, so a new group built on the back of CIAM, really, to rethink urban issues in the 1960s. And this is mindful to me of research on narratives of failure in architecture, particularly by Timothy Britton Catlin, because John Volker completely baffled James Sterling. He actively angered Alison Smithson, his fellow Team 10 players, by doing what he called a rural urbanism. So he was really building simple farms on the back of a government initiative to help farmers improve the efficiency of their farm buildings. He was addressing poverty in rural areas by making sure farmers had up-to-date facilities, trees. He was innovating the design of trusses for the easy assembly of barns. So it's another kind of otherist architecture that's been left out of the way that modernism's been told, but scholarship of the last decade or 2 decades is increasingly revealing modernism not as a monolithic juggernaut, but as a series of plural practices. And finally, next slide. Oh no, sorry, go back. Stay with John Volker. I've worked on the misunderstood, eccentric Buckler dynasty of Gothic revival architects who were so unbelievably obsessed with the past that it almost became a kind of sickness. And you can see that here. One of the architects, Charles Alban Buckler, who was a herald as well, extremely camp. He looks here and sort of bedizened in this late 19th century bling in the form of a herald's tabard and a so-called collar of S's. Totally estranged from the rest of the profession, he created his own world of desire by doing the sort of architecture he wanted with his own loyal, invariably Catholic fan base. And he was totally rejected by the big boys and by the press, rather reminiscent of Aaron Betsky in his 1997 book, Queer Space. Queer spaces to Betsky were no less than a realm of personal desire in a world of oppression. But for queer people, it's about acknowledging in the first place that it's not that they didn't exist in the past, of course they did, it's rather that historians haven't looked for them. So the very tools of architectural history, while they can recapture stories from the past, they can also suppress and eliminate them. And many historians like me want to uncover broader truths, wider ranging human experiences across time and place. And in so doing, we want to elevate what architectural history can do. And the Queer Spaces book is a vital example of this, and I think the most meaningful realization of that kind of idea of retrieval to date. So both Adam and I really were keen to publish an image-rich book, a book of spaces and stories that could celebrate the complexity, the richness of queer life, stories enacted through spaces. And we wanted to map unexpected continuities across temporalities, places, and typologies. Next slide. So our book comprises no less than 55 authors who together profile about 100 spaces. But of course, while we have so many spaces, there was a great limit in terms of what we could actually include. There's that inevitable contingent nature to the research process. We lacked good connections in some parts of the world. We had strong networks in others. And the way to perhaps remedy some of those absences was to try and use single examples to speak for much broader phenomena. So with that in mind, I'm digressing just one more moment by mentioning the film that you see here as a way into understanding one of the big themes of the book, and also as a major and pioneering part of the historiography, in this case, the visual historiography around queer spaces on which our own work has built. The 1996 film, The Watermelon Woman by Cheryl Dunye, is a work of autofiction about the central protagonist's journey of documenting the life of an unsung Black lesbian actress from the 1930s known as the Watermelon Woman. So the main character of the movie talks to subjects who might have remembered the Watermelon Woman, and a major source of narrative drama is that of archives. So old photographs, film clips, newsreels are part of the storytelling. The main character, who also visits what's satirically called the Center for Lesbian Information and Technology, or CLIT, which is a parody of the Lesbian Her Story Archives, or LHA. And the LHA was founded in a brownstone in New York City in 1974 that was organized as a domestic space in which lesbians were to feel welcome and to see and also touch a lesbian legacy. So the LHA aimed for an emotional rather than a narrowly intellectual experience of the archive, which is reminiscent of Anne Kvetkovich's 2003 book on lesbian culture, An Archive of Feelings. So both the LHA and its representation through CLIT in The Watermelon Woman point to the crucial role of archives within queer cultures and to their often unorthodox, inventive forms. It transpires at the end of the movie that the Watermelon Woman herself was the filmmaker's own creation. And the implication is that these voices need representation, even if you have to create it yourself. Next slide. Right, so finally to the book. Next slide, please. So we include all sorts of archives in the book that I just wanted to touch on a couple of them. Indeed, they're examples of what we might call archives of feeling, like on the left-hand side, the Trans Memory Archive in Buenos Aires, written up beautifully and empathetically in our book by Facundo Revuelta. It's a project of documenting the very existence of Argentine travesty trans people for posterity. So using a closed Facebook group, members of the trans community across Argentina uploaded personal photographs and shared anecdotes that spanned decades, finding one another again. And as the project got bigger, a small team of the community and also professional photographers got together and began digitizing photographs from the past, scanning them in high resolution to preserve trans memory, along with letters and other objects, reclaiming a hitherto simply unchronicled heritage. As Facundo puts it quite profoundly, I'm quoting, "Interrupted by exclusion and violence, many things from the past were lost, as documenting life was so difficult when existence itself took up all of one's energy." So another such archive of feeling included in the book is the Museum of Transology, and you see an artifact of that on the right-hand side. And the Museum of Transology in London is part of the Bishopsgate Institute, the UK's most significant collection it is of material culture that surrounds trans, non-binary, and intersex lives. So this artifact that I've decided to show you is an affordable lipstick. It's not brandished with a designer logo. It's well past its use-by date, I shouldn't wonder. But the tag is critically written by the donor themselves, and it tells us that it was the present from a sister who was the first family member to accept her sibling's gender transition. So it's both ordinary, but through its very ordinariness, it is actually quite extraordinary. So these two examples serve collectively to speak, if you like, of the distinctiveness of the archival project of archiving queer stories and artifacts. Of course, we couldn't include all the many pioneering, no less vital archives around the world, but we tried to give a broader sense of them through these examples. Next slide. So in the book, we've also tried to be as representative as possible, and this includes inclusion of perhaps more famous examples like Fonthill Abbey, the neo-Gothic residence erected in Wiltshire by William Beckford, and he was known to his contemporaries as much as an infamous bugger, so-called, as a writer, builder, and collector. But it was important that we looked as much at non-elite spaces and demographies as well. And the power structures of an elitist and patriarchal society in Britain have made it pretty rare for the historian to be able to access working class queer voices, which were even more silenced than elite gay spaces. So queer history has been dominated by the stories of middle and upper classes, privileged people, men in particular, who have left more evidence of their lives in archives, in literature, culture, and indeed on the landscape itself. So on the right-hand side here, you can see a prosecution file from circa 1950, which is also known, as you can see, as a buggery file. One of the key sources that the Lincoln historian Helen Smith used in our book, or rather reappropriated, to locate queer working class people, particularly cis men, desiring cis men in late 19th century and early 20th century industrial England. And of these, she found that a typical 2-up, 2-down terrace house, as shown here in Midhill Road in Sheffield, the home of a man that she just refers to as G, as one of the protagonists of her story. And she said poignantly that, quote, "Working class queer domestic spaces don't carry blue or even rainbow plaques. They hide in plain sight, like many of the men who lived in them." So for every man like G who was arrested, many others lived queer lives in streets just like this one, without traces in the historical record. Queer spaces are all around us. Next slide, please. So my final example, this is one of the first spaces that I commissioned, perhaps as someone that when I've lived in London, I've invariably lived in Peckham. And again, it had the advantage that I happen to know about it. So the Black, Lesbian and Gay Centre from 1981 to 1999 in London, I'll come on to Peckham in a moment, which preceded the foundations of the much better known London Lesbian and Gay Centre in London, which is also covered in the book, rather wonderfully by Professor Ben Campkin. Now the former, the Black, Lesbian and Gay Centre, is covered in our book by the filmmaker Veronica Mackenzie, but she talks not only about the centre, but really uses it as a peg on which to hang a much more general discussion about the infrastructure and politics, racial as much as queer politics of queer spaces in 1980s and 1990s Great Britain. And critically, she manages to do that within just a few hundred words. It's a short, punchy, jargon-free piece of writing with illustrations like all the other vignettes in the book. And she had a very sort of cavalier approach to footnotes. I don't think there is a footnote. It's bite-sized, it's digestible, it's well illustrated. Next slide, please. Now, the Black, Lesbian and Gay group initially was an important development. Could we have the next slide? was an development in the establishment of a Black queer community. So lest we forget, of course, that there was ample discrimination within the queer community itself. No doubt there still is. One can see that alive and kicking for anyone that uses sex or dating apps, by way of example. So it began with Friday evening meetings, which started in 1981 to provide a safe space and became a lifeline for many, as queer spaces so often do. A subcommittee was set up to find a space which could be used full time, which had secured funding from the Greater London Council. And in 1985, the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre moved into its first office in Tottenham, from which to base their search for a more permanent centre. Now, they were hindered by discriminatory landlords and the loss of funding, so it was a really long search for a physical space, but in spite of all these obstacles, they managed to form coalitions with unions and community groups, rallying thousands to protest against the rise in anti-gay sentiments along the way. The group also campaigned against negative portrayals of Black LGBTQ people as part of the Black Lesbians and Gays Against Homophobia in the Media campaign. And they also, through self-published literature, much of which fortunately survives in the LGBT archives at LSE. So these efforts, as Veronica Mackenzie says, contributed significantly to the empower of the Black queer identity. I think go back to the previous slide. In 1992, the centre finally secured a permanent home in a converted railway arch in Peckham Rye off Belladon Road, establishing the first Black lesbian and gay centre in Europe, possibly the world. And Peckham, by the way, is one of my queer havens. So it was particularly interesting to see that this queer pedigree, if you like, existed under those arches, and it was a pleasure to be able to put that, to secure those memories between the linen and rainbow foil boards of our book for posterity. So by the time we get to 1992 and the move to Peckham, the political climate and the challenges of securing funding made it difficult to maintain the space. And one councillor even stated that he would fund a Black lesbian and gay centre over his dead body, as is recalled in Veronica's documentary film on the centre titled Under Your Nose, which I'd recommend you to watch and which you see on the next slide. So the centre closed in 1999 and they moved to a small volunteer-run office. And when it closed, a volunteer moved the helpline into their home where the phone continued to ring for several years afterwards. So the centre, as Mackenzie says in our book, fostered many life-affirming friendships and relationships and was underpinned by the belief in a society that could be truly equal for everyone. Thank you. Over to you, Adam.
Sorry, I was trying to find where the mute button was. Why, thank you, Josh. How amazing. This book we've done, it's brilliant. Here we go. So, hi, everyone. I'm Adam, co-editor with Josh. We're following the same format. I just have more slides because I've got like too many random visual things that I produce all the time. But I'm a Londoner. And my sort of my background has been, I mean, I could say in the past haunted by queerness as being something that was sort of imposed on me by other people, but it's also been in a very affirmatory and positive part of my life and defined who I was. So I grew up in the 90s. I went to a posh public school and was outed at a very young age. I mean, young age, sort of 14, 15. And very quickly it got to the point where I could not go through the school without someone going with me to protect me, and I was physically assaulted every time I would leave, and the other kids from the other schools in the area would attack me in the streets, was pushed off buses, couldn't go into the local pubs, memories of trying to go to normal teenage parties, and word getting around that the batty boy was there, and I being told to run, for instance, because I was going to get knifed, and so I was actually asked to leave my school because of the bullying that I was receiving, because obviously I was causing problems for everyone else. And this is the kind of context that was made by all of you will know and love the Section 28 that Margaret Thatcher brought in 1987 that just created this very unpleasant context, and which amazingly is the Section 28 is what was given to the gay conservatives in the conference, the booth that they gave them in the conference last year, which I found typical of them. But yeah, and I was saved effectively by gay spaces. So I didn't have a school to go to. And I was allowed to study, and I was sort of taken under the wing of my local gay pub. They let me during the day only drinking tea, do my A-levels, and they let me for the first time realize or feel that there was no need to be ashamed, that actually I wasn't disgusting, and actually the things I wanted to do were okay, and actually that it actually could be quite beautiful, and there was a whole culture around it. And I sort of became part of the Soho scene very early on as a sort of mid-teenage years. Was around when I was older, when I was just around the corner when the bombing happened in the Admiral Duncan. But part of this was like a really exuberant and vibrant and quite wonderful scene where there was a kind of community that was producing a lot of visual culture, a lot of nightclubs. There was protest art, there was a lot of fashion, there was a lot of graphic design, there was a lot of really amazing kind of effusive expression of identity that was happening kind of in this sort of Section 28 relatively violent context. And I got a lot of I got a sense of confidence, a sense of belief in myself, and managed to get into architecture school. And it was kind of a little bit like going back to the high school, but with less violence, luckily. So it wasn't really, there was no violence involved, but the kind of disdain and dislike for any of the sort of topics that I had been taught over the previous few years were actually a really intrinsic part of my identity and the history which I share with all of these other queer people through time. It was absolutely not allowed, because architecture was school was full of depressed looking people wearing black turtlenecks, making 3D printed black and white models that looked like alien squid, and talking about how architecture was actually about either, I don't know, the fetishizing of beautiful concrete and the shadow and the light, or it was about technology and how technology should be represented, because that's by doing models that look like alien squid. And so there's been this kind of repetitive process of having to come out throughout my career, from progressively getting a little bit easier. But in university, it was the same thing. It was having to explain why the idea of expressing oneself and one's identity as a queer person of mixed background, which I am, which is also important to me, needed to be or should be or had any place being represented in architecture and architecture's aesthetics. And I kind of push that to a really extreme degree, because I think when one is faced with a lot of pushback, one argues, or at least I tend to argue even more strongly for my case. And similarly, my work became a kind of more extreme version of me than it would have otherwise been if I hadn't had all of these architects saying, what is this colorful rubbish? What is this aesthetic stuff? Why are there naked people in your videos? Why are you doing videos in the first place? What is, I think in my REBA part 1, the REBA examiner at my presentation, after I had left, said, this student can either choose to perform or present architecture, and he chose to perform, so I'm going to fail him, which my tutor didn't put up with. But this was the kind of attitude that was taken towards a lot of these issues and themes which interested me in architecture, which I now know are queer themes. And I developed this sort of relationship with space and architectural design, which was a way of building up my identity as a queer designer operating in architecture that I felt very comfortable with, which was something that began at the scale of the interior with clothing, which has always been important to me. The idea that the closet is not necessarily something you hide in. It's actually the place where if you don't fit in, if your body is something which is not accepted by wider society, if you're told that your body is not right, if you're made to feel ashamed of your body, if you're made to feel that what you want to do with other bodies is disgusting, the mirror and the clothing closet is the place where you can construct a sense of yourself. It's the very first place of architecture. It's where you can build a carapace around yourself that protects you, but at the same time represents and externalizes you and who you are, and hides the body, which you cannot control how other people judge. And you step one scale out from that to the interior, and there is the space of objects, and it's the space where you collect and you create an externalization of an identity which is not safe to be expressed in the public realm, in the space outside in the city, which can conform, or many people, there's a kind of dogma at the moment of context, of heritage, of things having to remain exactly how they are, but that means that the city embodies and represents only the kind of ethnicities, identities, and people who've always had power and have always existed in the space before that. So if you want to create a space for yourself, which many immigrants do and queer people do, it tends to be on the interior using objects. And this is something that I've explored throughout my work, the sort of rejection of an idea of space that is extensive and abstract, and creating space through the construction of objects which have meanings and stories, which are interchangeable with each other, and which mix cultures, which mix high and low and mix materials. And just this is Charles Moore's interior. He's an architect who throughout his career would actively within his own private spaces construct precisely these kinds of queer expressions of identity. And this is something that I've done from early projects. This is the Design Museum Identity Parade project, where I explored identity of a singular designer who for 3 months was locked in his home and had to create an object every single day using a different material technology that was tied to a life lived in social media, thereby embodying his identity of the time, through to scaling up and looking at the scale of the city, where this was the UK Rome Prize for Architecture, which I got 2 years after the Identity Parade residency project at the Design Museum. I went to Rome and began to look at a larger scale, so not necessarily just the individual, but for queer stories embedded, like Josh was telling you some amazing ones just now from Peckham and elsewhere, and we have many of these in the book, but they're very hidden. So looking for queer stories, in this case in Rome, that are riven and run like veins throughout the city, but are not canonized. They're not necessarily, well, they're not definitely not documented in the architectural history books, let alone the more visual books oriented at designers. And I kind of went through an archaeology with a lot of help from the historians who were living in the British Academy at the time, discovering a whole range of stories. And for each of these, because aesthetics is very important to me, the expression as a designer and not a queer architect of that content, turning them each into stories and designs. This is just one of the stories which I discovered, which was Henrik Christian Andersen, who was the longtime lover of Henry James, who lived just around the corner, it turned out, from the British Academy, built a whole house. And there's a museum which is still actually active because he was endowed with a huge amount of wealth by his brother, who owned mines in Norway. So it's a museum that no one ever goes to. This is an animation which is not working because my computer couldn't show PowerPoint. But if you imagine, it's an endless enfilade of very colorful rooms based upon the story of Valentino being very upset in the way Josh was very upset about UPVC windows destroying these beautiful arts and crafts. I don't know, I'm imagining Oriel windows, but Valentino being very upset about McDonald's setting up shop in front of his studio building, and then turning all of these into objects, a kind of queer expression of complexity and history and architectural meaning, but through small things which are normally rejected as being kitsch, irrelevant, and not particularly serious. It was something that I do throughout my work, but also I advocate, and I've been advocating for quite a long time through writing, for the kind of possibility of these spaces being recognized, existing spaces being recognized, but also for the opportunities within urbanism, planning, and architecture for queer architects and designers and those of other backgrounds to be able to produce work which is wildly different, which this is my work, but the idea is to create a space of difference in which a lot of different aesthetics that are not simply the aesthetics of the academy of a given moment in time, and how that can exist in a city. And I've done this through various projects in the city. Sorry, I shouldn't flip through them that quickly. From gateways in King's Cross to this is the entry space to the Triennial in Melbourne, which was a sort of 400 square meter cafe and ticketing space that was turned into a sort of, I guess, a gender-fucked whipped ice cream, where the colors of the different gender assignations of children are mixed together, as well as a series of graphical and formal representations of body parts, which are always simultaneously both male and female, as well as a programmatic disbursement. So it was very meaningful and extremely exciting when Reba got in touch a few years ago about potentially doing a book on queer spaces, because something that I would have absolutely loved to have had as a dyslexic designer at architecture school, who couldn't really get very much from giant, whacking great prolix and complicated postmodern theoretical texts about gender. Everyone else had easy access to a kind of lineage of canonical modernist, postmodernist, parametric, whatever, super Dutch designers that they could worship, that were backup for their work that would show that whatever scribble that they did and presented to the tutors was based upon substantial foundations. And that was something that I couldn't do, and I had to find my own references, which were pretty much always ridiculed and were normally not from within the architectural canon. So having a book, or a series of books ideally, where there was just accessible case studies with really good images, with writers that I could then look at their other writings and learn more about those types of queer spaces, would have been hugely beneficial for me. So I kind of latched on to this idea and opportunity with all the vehemence of someone who is being given the opportunity to sort of start again in a way. And that's kind of the drive for why I was so incredibly excited, and am so incredibly excited about having pulled this off with Josh, Claire, and the team at the RIBA. And as you've probably seen from Josh's examples, there is a really wide, we've gone for as wide array of types of spaces as possible. So we don't define what queer space is in any way. We try and show it through the diversity of spaces which are present in the book. My examples tend to be more architectural. This is Coppelia they tend to also stand in for a type of space, as Josh says, because there are many, many more that we couldn't put in. So, for instance, this is Coppelia in Havana, which is a kind of reappropriated space, and there's quite a few of those in the book. It is I believe it's the world's largest ice cream parlor, built in the mid 1960s in the center of Havana. The idea of ice cream as a luxury for the masses was very important to Castro at the time, after having visited Canada and apparently very much liking ice cream. He wanted to present the people of Cuba with ice cream that was better, more abundant, and much cheaper than anything that would have been on offer in the United States, where it was only available to people who had money. And so for this, he built a palace to ice cream for the people, which is an absolutely spectacular Pierluigi Nervi style domed structure, concrete structure in the middle of Havana, next to major civic buildings. So really given a very important prominence in the kind of symbolic landscape of the regime. And this was opened at a time at the height of oppression of the queer community. People were being put into concentration camps for buggery, along with Jews, and a lot of them escaped to the United States. This is something that has been apologized for in the interim. But even though that was happening, what's wonderful is that this ice cream store, which had I think it was something crazy like 1,000 ice cream flavors, became the center of queer cruising in Havana. And pretty much everyone, for significant periods of the week, buying ice cream there were queers. And there was a whole language of, depending on what color ice cream you would order, on what combination of colors of ice cream flavors you would order, it was a signification of your sexual preferences, your fetishes, or the kind of things that you were into. And so this symbol of the socialist regime that was oppressing the queer community became the very place where the queer community took over and identified and lived. And actually, to this, apparently, in the kind of current urban landscape, it's once again very important for cruising, because it's one of the few places that has free Wi-Fi. And you're free to exist as a queer person there now. And apparently there's a lot of people coming to use Grindr, etc., near this building because of the free Wi-Fi. Another space that this is actually very influential across Western architecture is Alan Buchsbaum's incredible radical interior designer of the 1970s and 80s in New York. This was his office and where he lived. So it was his studio flat office, where the boundaries that were blurred completely between passion, love, work, play. I think there was a saying that he had that you could never trust a client or go with a client until you had a naked bath with them. And that bath is actually in the office. So if the mezzanine above there is where all of the people draft and work. And it looks down on the bathtub, which they would, in the middle of the day, sometimes go and enjoy. And then the sleeping area is just down a few steps. So the whole thing kind of broke down these traditional notions of separation and privacy. And also, it was clad entirely in ceramics. Here they're white, but in different places used colorful ceramics, industrial, swimming pool grade colorful ceramics, which is something that Alain Buspam used across many of his works, and is something that came directly from the bathhouses in New York, which was where people would meet up to hook up and sleep together when they didn't necessarily have a home where they could do it. And that's something that was adopted by a lot of postmodern architects around the world, first in the East Coast, but the sources in the queer spaces of bathhouses in New York was of course completely lost. I should have remembered. So yeah, there's some more photos where you can see how all of the spaces are visible. And I'll show you just one more space, which is just shows the kind of interesting, very often paradoxical spaces that we have in the book. This is the light coffin, or Dracula's den. I think it's actually referred to as Dracula's den by the locals who don't know the owners. It's a house that was built in the late 90s by the architect Osamu Ishiyama for two gay clients, a barber and a painter, an artist, who wanted to have complete privacy. So they wanted to have a space where they could exist without the prying eyes of the community, without the prying eyes of the public. And this is possibly the most extreme representation of how privacy is so incredibly important for a lot of the queer spaces that we show, especially the domestic ones. And this is a bit paradoxical because they wanted to have the lifestyle of living in the countryside. I believe this is in Chiba. It's a lovely rural area, but they created a box which is completely impenetrable without a single window, where inside they could live the life that they wanted to, where they didn't have to be stuck with the notion of rooms, with the notion of domestic decorum, with the notions of routines that they were so suffocated by in Tokyo, where social pressures and social existence was very articulated and orchestrated. So within this space, there's what, one might, that's definitely, this shows how there's no such thing as a queer aesthetic, completely different to many of the other things like Buspam's or my work, but is nonetheless extremely queer in the way that they, as private individuals, created their own sense of domesticity. Another thing is that it's a sort of the Alyssa Bueno, Ivan Lopez Munuera has written the entries for, I should have mentioned, for Alain Buspam's studio and for Coppelia. Alyssa Bueno has written the entry for the light coffin, and she explains very nicely how this embodies for her the situation in the 90s in Japan, where it was supposedly a renaissance or a kind of golden period for gay culture, where it was celebrated on television. It was very present and there was a lot of interest in gay figures. They were on television a lot. But at the same time, there was a feeling that there was too much of a public gaze and there was too much expectations. And actually that came with a lot of negativity in terms of pressures to conform. And this was specifically set within that context, and that's specifically the context which this couple wanted to escape. So that's the end of our presentation. I think we kind of roughly kept to time.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Not sure if the format worked, but
yeah, no, that was great. Thanks, Joshua and Adam, for really engaging talks. I mean, what a great plug for the book.
We try. It's a good book.
Those of you out there in the Zoom room, please submit your questions via chat in the first instance, and then we'll give you the opportunity to ask them yourself. And I guess while our audience loosens up their typing fingers, I'll take the chance to ask you a question myself. I thought it was really powerful that you both began with your own stories. And I wonder whether you're keen to say that there's a special role for the biographical and or the autobiographical in discussing and producing queer space.
Well, certainly that was my initial claim, which is why I decided to try and think about whether what would be enriching for me to do that? Because if I was giving a talk at Newcastle University ordinarily, let's say I was asked to talk about the butlers, one would imagine I wouldn't start indulging in autobiography. Whereas somehow it is appropriate, it feels appropriate here. And I think the personal is very much the leitmotif of the Queer Spaces book. And it's not just the personal of the spaces themselves, but it's also how the authors have responded and seen themselves through the spaces that they've chosen to write about. So yeah, that would be my response. Do you agree, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's extremely important. I mean, I was just explaining to a student right before we joined this talk that I felt that they were doing a project on queer space, and I felt that they hadn't inserted their subjectivity enough into it. They were trying to be too objective and cold in their approach to it. And I think for me, it's always most potent and successful when queer historians and queer designers insert themselves in some way into the work they're doing. And it helps because it helps people understand it. I find that, you know, for many people, you know, if you are comfortable in the architectural profession, and I speak as a designer, where the kind of the canon, the value judgments, the history that you've been taught, if you feel comfortable that reflects you, that is something that you're happy to see the world through, or a lens that you're happy to see the world through, that it reflects you as well, which it does for many people, then you don't really need that explained to you. And every single time you talk about why Corbusier is amazing, you don't really have to start from scratch to an audience of architects and explain the very foundations of why architecture with that approach is valuable. And with queer design and queer spaces, very often people don't even know the foundations or the beginnings. And actually a way to circumvent that is to insert yourself into the story and explain how you relate to the specific aspect of queer history or queer aesthetics that you're working with. And it kind of does the job of not having to lay out the entire foundations of like an entire history which they're not aware of. So I just find it like it's a very useful tool for people to understand. Otherwise, you're just giving the same history lesson every single time.
Yeah, I don't think it's something that's easy to do, though. I mean, it's not, you know, but I think it is moving away from that kind of neutrality. So finding counter strategies and thinking about history writing, not as something that is neutral, objective, but finding those counter strategies really, and being much more moving away from that ostensible neutrality. And so I found that very exciting as a historian, but I don't know necessarily how I would do it in all cases.
Great, thank you. We've got a question here. James Longfield.
Hello. I'm not going to turn my camera on because last time I asked a question, my computer crashed. So there's a half a chance that that's going to happen again. But thank you for a really wonderful talk. And I was sort of interested, I guess, in this idea of, you're sort of talking about expressing one's identity, perhaps from through the sort of canon of architecture. I'm interested in your thoughts of how you see that expression interfacing with the kind of the expression of your clients and, you know, sort of wider public in projects. How does that kind of work as a sort of a relationship and a way into a project, if that makes sense? Could
you cover that, Adam? I don't have clients.
That's an answer in itself. That's fair enough.
Yeah, well, that should be the answer for all academics. If only the architectural ones were so honest. If you could repeat that, because actually my headphones stopped working and I had to unplug them and replug them while you were asking the question. I'm so sorry. I just heard clients.
That's all right. I come with my questions must come with general technical difficulties, I think.
It seems so. I'm sorry.
There you go. No, not at all. I was just wondering about this idea of bringing your own kind of personal identity and expression through a project. And how that kind of interfaces then with the expression of clients and sort of wider publics and things like that.
So I think for me at least, I've never had a problem with that, because the idea of universality and neutrality is rubbish. Universality and neutrality in architecture is actually just the current aesthetic that's dominant for the majority, either in mainstream culture, the Sarah Beanie grey for developers, or in academic culture, where it changes every 10 years, but there's like a dominant aesthetic for certain schools, and then people go out into the world and they do that. The problem is they don't consider it as identity. They think that's just universality. They think that's just the best as it is. But of course, that is aesthetics, because architecture is aesthetics, right? Otherwise we would just build boxes, which some do. But that is a type of identity, but it's not diverse. It doesn't allow for difference. And so the way I think about it, I think we've been trained to sort of feel shame if you show yourself in your architecture somehow, because it should be all about the client and you should just be neutral. But actually the neutral takes 5 years to learn at architecture school, and it's actually a whole aesthetic. So I feel very comfortable going to the client, and I'm not dominating them with my style. I'm just swapping the neutral for my neutral. And then, of course, there's loads that the client gives to it. And the clients come to me knowing that there's a kind of aesthetic world that they're being part of, but there's a lot of flexibility within that, probably more than there would be within a John Pawson project, for instance. I think there's probably less flexibility there. So I don't really see that as a problem. It's just simply the way I operate, right? I have a relatively flexible aesthetic language, which has evolved through my personal story, which is a story that does relate in many, many ways to a lot of other people, and more generally and objectively, but I don't pretend to say it's universal. But my story has led to a particular aesthetic, which meets very well with clients and changes a lot depending on the project. It's just not what is considered, it's not bricks, which has kind of become the universal thing now, or it's not folded pointy parametric things, which happen to be the academic standard when I was at school. But those are aesthetics. They're just lying to themselves in order to crush all difference and make everyone like themselves. They're lying, saying that it's universal or it's neutral. There's no such thing as neutral. The least neutral thing in the world is a white room.
Yeah,
it's an erasure. Really, it's an erasure of everything else. That's what it is.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So sort of making a claim for kind of fronting and centering aspects of one's identity, and what that kind of brings to the table.
Yeah, because otherwise you're just fronting and centering the group identity of architecture at a given point of elite, or a type, or maybe trad, for instance, architecture at a given point in time. All you're doing is being a good liberal and creating your own existence effectively within your world of operation, your creative sphere.
Geraint Franklin has what he calls a historian's question in the chat.
That's for Josh then.
Oh gosh, right, what is it?
Geraint, do you want to ask the question?
Hi guys, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just read out the question. I was just interested really, it's just a two-parter. What's the earliest example that you've looked at in your book? And I guess the follow-on is, how do you establish intention or agency from a historical era, bearing in mind all that goes with that in terms of understanding that connection?
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the earliest. I can't think of anything earlier than late Georgian. And I think the early examples are British examples. I think that's correct. So we have A La Ronde, which is quite a famous building, the sort of 16-sided cottage ornate in Devon, which is from very just about the turn of the 19th century, so about 1790s. Lee Priory as well, the Strawberry Hill Child. Is there earlier one, Adam?
Yeah, so I just want to jump in because the notional starting point that we had was Winckelmann. So we didn't include him, but that was like the starting point. So it's from sort of Winckelmann onwards was the time frame that we were looking at. It's him as sort of like right. the queering of art history from that point on.
Okay. Yes, that the Devon example is fabulous, isn't it? And that's the one I was thinking of. How do you? The broader question I suppose arising from that, and it's not exclusive to time because it also applies to space. How do you establish, queer intention across other cultures than those of your own. Does that make any kind of sense as a question?
Yes, I think so. And I think also, I mean, I'm just thinking of what else there is. So we have Plas Nawith as well, I think it's pronounced, it probably isn't, the famous home of the ladies of Llangollen that one thinks of as Georgian lesbians, that eccentric sort of Gothic home that's resisting usual domestic arrangements, right? So I think in the sense that it's homosocial living, but I think one has to be very careful to avoid anachronism, which is basically what you're saying, and be very loose and capacious in understanding what queerness is at the given point in time. I think maybe the Helen Smith example, I don't know whether you remember, so we're looking at the two up, two down in the 1950s, and I think again there it's moving completely away from the heterosexual homosexual binary, which actually is probably anachronistic even to working class men in 1950s north of England. So it's thinking actually someone in a coal mine, let's say, with male lovers in 1930s Durham or whatever, might also find that irrelevant. It might have been more recognizable to someone in the Bloomsbury set in the 1930s. So the whole idea of homosexual culture needs to be thought about. And I think historians in the book have done that in interesting ways. Do you want to add to that at all?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, who else? So that's always, I'm like, no! But so Geraint, we kind of went into this wanting, I think I tend to use really terrible analogies, but it was a little bit like, what was it? I was saying it's like love. Queer is like love, that, everyone knows it and thinks about it, but actually there's no real definition. You can write 1 million songs and there will be 1 million more songs forever about it. And we kind of wanted to keep it as open as possible. And so we were kind of actively looking for spaces that were pushing at the edges of what we might consider, or what we had considered within our initial list of spaces, for instance, of what we might think queer might be ourselves. So we were actively courting connections, links, reaching out to networks of people through colleagues and friends that would open up doors to spaces in parts of the world, but also periods that were completely out of our understanding or out of our sort of knowledge base. And so, yeah, I mean, the only thing that we kind of were actively not defining, but we did avoid, I think correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but we sort of didn't include anything that was about interpreting something as being queer. There somehow had to be a factual basis to, people who were gender non-conforming or sexually non-conforming in terms of their sexuality existing in that space, and it wasn't necessarily a layering of interpretation over something, and that sort of metaphorical type of interpretive work is something that we haven't included. So it's always actually about real bodies in real spaces.
Yeah, sure, that makes sense. Thank you. And can I just say, I'm really looking forward to seeing the book. It's very exciting.
We are too. There's a delay because of COVID with the suppliers.
Oh no!
Yeah.
Building up expectation.
It's soon, hopefully. They keep saying soon. It's a very beautiful thing because, as Josh mentioned, it's linen with a sort of debossed foil. It's going to be very nice.
Tactile.
Exactly.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Geraint.
I'm going to ask you one more question. And I think, Josh, you described your project as a historian in terms of queer spaces as missing spaces of architectural history.
Yeah.
And obviously history operates in the present, and Nigel will carry on. Something happened there. I've got the technological glitches now. So yeah, your project as a historian in terms of queer spaces as missing spaces of architectural history. Nigel Whiteley wrote about Rayner Banham as a historian of the immediate future. And I guess I'm interested in missing spaces of contemporary and indeed immediate future architectural production. And I wondered if there are any that you wanted to emphasize, or that the book kind of draws attention to.
You mean contemporary spaces?
Yeah, or even, I suppose thinking about this series, looking to the future of architecture, kind of the immediate future. What are the missing spaces now? What will they be?
It's a massive question. In some ways, I don't feel prepared to answer it, but I think, I do think it's about untold stories of difference, really. I mean, a part of me does think, all of what's happening in the culture at the moment, there is a new paradigm. History is being radically rewritten to embrace diversity in particular. We're emancipating ourselves from, let's say, a Western or Eurocentric canon increasingly. We're reorganizing the atlas away from nation states. We're interested in more bottom-up histories, new consciousnesses. So I think this prevailing reorientation project should include queer spaces. So I suppose I find myself wondering why can't, assuming we're going to continue to have so-called survey books, why can't a survey book on 20th century architecture, a big blockbuster by Yale, let's say, not include queer spaces? So that's one way I'm thinking about it. What are the surveys of the coming century? But I can't think of specific examples perhaps at this moment.
So if I guess from my perspective, there's no future without a past, and I think a really difficult thing for architecture students is, like I was saying before, to have the ability to create new spaces which might be considered queer spaces, but also designs which might be considered queer designs. You have to have a lineage. You have to have a past. You have to feel that you have a tradition. Otherwise, you have nothing to stand on. So in order to have a future, we have to create the past, which is easily accessible for all architects and designers. And so frankly, I think that the act of creating this easily accessible and shared history, which is right up until the present, is a way of making more possibilities for the future. So for instance, a student that I just got off the tutorial with, who was in ETH in Switzerland, an amazingly intelligent student, is doing projects that I would have never been able to do when I was back in university, that even a few years ago would have not been able to be possible. And he'll maybe struggle when he goes out into the architectural profession, because everyone's going to be like wanting to concrete this or brick that, but he's going to push, and maybe the next generation are actually going to go out, and then they're going to be able to go one step further, and they'll be building buildings. And the same thing for various different communities of diverse communities. But also, I would like to say that geographically, things are not all the same. So you have around the world a lot of different statuses, legal statuses, social status for queer people, gender non-conforming people, people with different sexualities, and it's kind of quite a, I guess, British-centric, American-centric way of seeing it. That like, oh, we're all done. Like, where do we go now? But actually, all of the things that we have in the book are different places in the world. They're all relevant right now. So they're all active case studies for how you can operate as a queer person, creating queer spaces in different parts of the world. And we do have some contemporary ones that are quite literally probably where a whole part of Western culture is going in the future. So for instance, we have the Victorian Pride Centre in Melbourne, which is this humongous sort of like $5 million or more, it's like $10-15 million building, which is the center of gay culture. And they've got like business startup centers and like performance. It's like a opera house, a municipal opera house for queer culture. It's incredible, but it's kind of institutionalization of queerness, which is very, very different from the people who are creating pop-up nightclubs, which constantly move around and have to be very, very careful about the identity of who is organizing them and who is attended and who's buying the tickets in Dhaka in Bangladesh. So it's I think it's a question that is maybe not necessarily so relevant because it's not quite so linear for queer spaces and queer design. It's kind of chronologically coexistent.
Great. Thank you. I think that's a really rich place to bring this session to a close, and indeed to bring our series to a close. So thank you, Adam, Joshua, for speaking to us today.
Thank you, Adam.
Fantastic talks. As I said, this is the final talk in the series, and I want to thank everyone who joined us along the way, all our excellent speakers and our wonderful audiences. And special thanks too to Mike West for keeping things running so well behind the scenes. Thanks, Mike. Many of the talks are available to watch back on the Farrell Centre website.